What does it mean to live life to the fullest, train to your potential, and perform at your best?
Leave nothing on the table. That's a non-negotiable, is that I strive to be better every day. Because if I'm not on top of my game, how is anybody else going to follow me down the road?
Keep demanding more of yourself to live up to that potential and to stay hungry.
Training is progress. You know, when I look at the word training, I think of steps, baby steps to get somewhere that you want to be. And that is basically your life journey.
It's a mindset in itself, man. It's like, it's not just about, I know that for you, a lot of that's about the physical, but we're constantly in training, whether it's growing our skill sets, whether it's growing our physical bodies, whether it's growing our relationships, whatever. And all of that's a training ground. And that kind of goes back to the mindset that we just talked about.
You underestimate yourself and you don't even start. But then once you start, you often surpass what you thought you could do.
Perform at your best, mate. That's sort of what life is all about. You know, I want to have the knowledge, I want to have the fitness, the health, the ambition and drive that no matter what comes along, when that next phone call comes, I can just say yes. I don't have to worry. Just go and do it.
Yo, what is up, guys? Welcome to this episode of the Live, Train, Perform podcast. I'm your host, Sean Kober. Joining me in today's episode is my mate Leo Tyson, who has been in Thailand for a number of years. He interned for me at Tiger Muay Thai. He's got his own business now. I'm sure that's something we'll dive into. But Leo, welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thank you very much for having me, bro. It's good to be here.
Good, mate. I'm really excited for this chat. You are a subject matter expert in a few fields that I'm not that versed in. So every time I talk to you about these topics, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say and then how I can then apply them to my own clients, my own coaching process. So for the audience, can you give them a quick 5-minute introduction to who you are, what you're doing here, what you specialize in?
Awesome, bro. Thank you. So today we're going to be chatting female physiology, which is cool. It's a subject that somehow, as random as it seems, has become kind of interested and kind of passionate about now. So the quick intro for me is I came out here at 16 and 17. Lived here for a little while to have some fights for Tiger Muay Thai. Wasn't good enough to make it and eventually decided I liked the coaching side of it more than the fighting anyway. So I moved back to England when I was 18, got PT qualified, and kind of here we are. Just went through that conventional route of working with clients, filling my diary, going on courses, studying, rinsing and repeating for about 6 years.
Ticking the boxes.
Ticking the boxes, yeah, exactly, bro. And that was where I kind of learned this stuff along the way. And then about 3 years ago, I was like, I'm burnt out and I miss Phuket. Felt like business was in a good enough place online to move back out here. So yeah, and that's when I met you, came and asked if I can guest coach at Tiger. And 3 years later, here we are.
Here we are doing a podcast. Yeah, cool, man. So what made you get into going down the path of female-specific physiology?
Yeah. So yeah, it sounds like a random one, doesn't it? But the specific story that kind of happened, there was this one incident in particular that really got me like interested in it. And I was training this client one morning. I trained her for quite a while, like maybe nearly 6 or 7 months at this point. And she was just having a really bad workout. And I obviously didn't know why. Her numbers are way off.
Maybe putting the blame on her?
Pardon?
Were you putting the blame on her?
Yeah.
Anything like that? Yeah, man, sorry to cut you off, man, but that was so common for me as well. Like when I first started working with people, it was like, if my clients aren't getting results, like you're not following the plan. Like it was their problem. It was their fault, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, bro. You just don't know. You just kind of don't know any better. You don't understand the variables that influence progress outside of just tracking macros or following a meal plan plus training. But in general, she was doing great. It was just this one kind of specific session.
Right.
Her numbers were off. Like she has a great low bar squat, but that was really off. And I just remember thinking like, what is going on here?
And you on the piss last night?
Yeah, like what? It's like a Wednesday morning. Like, come on. I think it was Wednesday. It was a long time ago. And in between sets of leg press, she's like almost nearly kind of tearing up a bit. And I'm like, I think we'll just kind of call this a session. And it's all good. I wasn't angry at her or anything. She was just a bit annoyed with herself, and I was just like, just one of those things, right? It happens sometimes. And then she messages me a few hours later, going, hey, I've just started my period. Could I possibly come back in this evening? Do you have any slots? And I was just like, I have no clue why that's relevant.
Yeah.
But like, sure, and I think kind of just my intuition was like, all right, there's maybe something to this because otherwise she wouldn't have said that. Whereas normally I'd be like, no, just rest, recover. You've already trained this morning. Like it wasn't a full workout, but we've already trained. Like it's no point doing a second session in a day. And I'm really glad that I kind of did let my intuition guide me that, all right, maybe there's something to this. Since she said it, like, sure, I'll come back in. I had a 1 hour gap between 2 clients anyway.
How old was she?
She was in her early 30s.
How old were you at this time?
I was probably not even 19.
Yeah, right. So she was obviously had picked up on something through her own experience. And then she's like, okay, maybe this is what's going on. This is why I wasn't performing this morning. Maybe I'll give it another crack this afternoon.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, that's cool.
So, yeah, and that's why it's so important to listen to clients. I think the majority of the time it's our job to be like, no, that's not a good idea or whatever. But there's a lot of times where you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes if the client does say something like that, then there might be something to it. So I was like, yeah, sure, come back in. And she crushed it. And like, not only was it a complete 180 from the morning's workout, it was actually a really, really, really good workout, which doesn't make sense considering we already did train at least some legs that morning. I'm like, you should be a bit tired and fatigued. Like, how are you hitting PBs on your back squat? And just a completely different person, energy, mood, or, just confidence getting under the bar. And I was like, well, that makes absolutely no sense. So I should probably go away and kind of look into that. Yeah. And the kind of catalyst for that is, I think all coaches, like, that's our job, is to solve problems and get your client the best results possible, and do right by your client, which I don't always think is the same thing as getting them the best results possible, because sometimes getting them the best results possible is a contradiction of doing right by them at the expense of their health. Or sometimes it's just not related, like maybe referring out, for example, or whatever it might be. So doing right by your client maybe isn't always the same thing as getting them the best results possible. So both of those. And of course, selfishly, like, I'm not doing this to not be the best that I can be. Like, I want to enjoy my career and enjoy mastering my craft. So I went away and I kind of started looking into, why would you train better once your period has started? I think was what I literally Googled. I didn't know where to start. And then just kind of went through this process of being like, okay, well, there is something about this late luteal phase leading up to menses starting, which has a series of, implications for mood, strength, coordination. And sometimes it isn't as abrupt as menses starting. Cool, everything's good. But that is where we do
So just pause there. What are you saying?
Menses meaning your periods.
Oh, okay.
Menstruation. Yeah, no worries, bro. It always feels a bit weird when I use the word period, like almost I'm not allowed to kind of thing. So I call it menses, but it's technically termed. But menses, menstruation, period starting.
Yep.
Is when we start to get that increase in estrogen again. So yeah, that kind of happened, and then I just kind of went down the rabbit hole from there, really. And I was pretty lucky that I had a few clients that year, female clients that year and the subsequent year on contest prep. And obviously now you have a situation where you can't necessarily blame these big variables and things that like, why is this happening? You can't blame that on, well, they're a Gen Pop client and their lifestyle varies, which is reason for your performance and strength, etc. varying. Like, that isn't really happening. They're on contest prep. Everything's controlled and consistent and dialed in. So the only variable really left is the menstrual cycle. So that started to make, a lot of that stuff kind of more evident to me. And just in my own pursuit of getting the best results possible, and doing right by my clients, I kind of went down those rabbit holes, really. And yeah, the more you learn, the more you realize that females really aren't just smaller guys. And it's very hard to kind of work that out, because there is still a huge bias done in sports research being predominantly done on guys. Females weren't really used in sports science studies until the mid 1980s. Like, that isn't that long ago. And because there are so many variables to the menstrual cycle, or lack of one, and differences between phases, which is, I know what we're going to get into a bit, it makes it very, very hard for, the everyday person to have a clue what's going on, let alone be able to control that in a study and therefore, equate for it. Which means that it is kind of quite hard to learn this stuff. There isn't a massive amount out there, especially aimed at fitness professionals in the context of working with a client. So
yeah, 100%, man. That's why I wanted to get you on, mate, is because I've seen you give seminars on this stuff. You've given like a coaches development series for me and my coaches at Tiger, and I really took a lot out of it. A lot of the stuff was kind of like touching on things that I'd already learned, but it was like putting it all together, and just kind of diving a little bit deeper into these different, things that we need to consider as coaches. So yeah, that's why I want to really get you onto this podcast and dive into this in a lot more detail, man.
Yeah, bro.
Now, a few things to unpack in the start there. That was a lot of awesome information. The first thing I want to talk about is, do you get any pushback from people because you are educating on female-specific physiology as a male? Because, you know, obviously you said menzies, and I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I'm sure I do, but no one says it to me.
Okay.
It's one of those, like, that was a very large part of the reason why I didn't really talk about it and create content on social media around it for a long time, was kind of just that fear of it not being received well.
Gotcha.
But then I was like, that's kind of ridiculous because I have mostly female clients anyway. I'm doing it with them anyway. So I'm kind of doing them a disservice. And anyone that wants to listen, it's completely up to you if you do or don't want to listen to a guy talking about it. I'd understand if not. But I'm then potentially doing those people a disservice. You know, the amount of people that have come to me and I onboard them, and it turns out they have endometriosis or PCOS or all of these things that they don't really know anything about. It turns out that their depression was being caused by the pill. And because they've been on the pill since they were 15, they never remembered what it's like to not be on the pill.
Yep.
So it's like I'm doing these people a disservice if I don't, you know, try and do right by my clients, and if you want to watch and read it, my content. So of course, I'm sure there's loads of people out there, but by default, they're kind of probably not engaging with me and therefore telling me, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
So yeah, I think a lot of females, not that I can speak on their behalf, but at least from what like my friends that are girls tell me and my clients tell me, is that they're quite happy about it, if anything, you know, almost relieved. Like, it's not a taboo subject. It's not dirty to have a period. Like, you know, all girls, unless you're on birth control, postmenopause will have them. It just is what it is. And I think a lot of women would like their other half or their boss or their guy friends to understand that a little bit more. I mean, most girls don't understand it. So it's always funny. A couple of times people have said to me like, oh, you know, what do you know about that? And I'm like, what do you know about it? And they're always like, yeah, I guess nothing. So it's like, you know, the girls themselves don't know anything about it. So, you know, why not try and educate?
100%, man. Like, I think I shared, you were doing like some, like a coaching kind of course for coaches. And I shared one of your posts on my stories or something. And I had a guy reach out to me and was like, what would this dude know about female specific physiology? And I was like, well, just because he's a male doesn't mean he doesn't know what he's fucking talking about. It's like, you know, an oncologist doesn't need to have cancer to know what they need to do to fucking treat cancer, you know what I mean? So, dude, I think it's a topic that definitely needs to be opened up to the wider public. And, you know, again, so many things to unpack in what you just said there. One of the things that came up, which we're going to dive into in a moment, is the lack of education around birth control. You know, birth control's been around for what, like 60, 70 years or something like that. And, you know, there wasn't any long-term studies done on it back then. And it's only kind of in the last decade or so that information's coming out about how it affects your hormones long-term and, you know, the implications that it can have on you know, physiology.
Yeah.
So we'll dive into that in a moment. But the next thing I want to bring up as well is I've actually got my my journal from my yoga course last year. So I went back to Australia and did my yoga course with a bunch of veterans as an alternate therapy for PTSD and anxiety, depression, things like that. So we could basically take that information, the principles, back to our network and be able to, you know, help people manage their minds and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, it was a veteran-heavy yoga course with all these, you know, infantry soldiers that have been deployed numerous times to Afghanistan, you know, war fighters, et cetera, et cetera. And the component on the course where we're diving into, you know, female physiology, menstrual cycle and stuff, some of the boys are like, why the fuck are we learning this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, listen, fellas, when do most guys have issues when it comes to, you know, anxiety, depression, PTSD? It's like normally something massive's happened in their life. They've lost their job. They've moved on from the military. They've lost their identity. They have a massive Barney with the missus, or the missus leaves with the kids, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, you know, guys, we need to understand what our partners are doing, where they're at on their menstrual cycle. So then we can go, all right, well, during this phase, probably not a good idea to bring up certain topics with them. Let's not create conflict during this phase. Let's maybe wait to this phase when things have balanced out a little bit and their hormones are a little bit more regulated, and, you know, it's going to be a lot more of an open conversation, open flowing conversation. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, for sure, mate. Yeah, I think your other half's only going to really appreciate it if you try and understand them as much as possible. And
maybe you can help them understand what's going on as well. Because like you said, man, maybe they don't understand what's happening with their emotions and, we'll talk about all the different physiological responses that occur through the different phases of the cycle and things like that, how to adjust that, adjust your training to suit that, how to adjust your nutrition, hydration, how to basically start putting these processes in place on a daily basis to work in line with what's happening with your biology, man, because you can't fight it, right?
Yeah.
Can't fight biology, you got to work with it. Yeah.
And even if the effects for you aren't that profound, like some people fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle a lot, other people less so, but it should still be pretty empowering to be able to proactively kind of deal with this stuff instead of reactively, like, I feel rubbish today, Like, I know a lot of girls, a lot of females that will kind of plan their life around it a little bit. Like, if you know you're not going to be your best self for 3 days out of the month, obviously if you're employed, it's a bit different, but if you're self-employed, maybe that isn't when you try and film content for social media, for example, you do that in advance, or you don't plan going on a podcast if you know that affects you, but you can't do that if you don't understand it in the first place. So then those small tweaks to being proactive allow you to obviously feel very empowered on kind of taking back control of maybe matching your life, your training, your work, your relationship, whatever it might be, around that a little bit. Again, that's may or may not be too relevant. Some girls have PMS so bad, premenstruation syndrome symptoms so bad, that it's actually PMDD, so it's a disorder, and they have to go on antidepressants for a handful of days out of the month. That affects 5 to 10% of females at reproductive age with a menstrual cycle, which obviously is really, really, really sad. That's kind of quite soul destroying to know that you're going to go through that every month. And other females don't know when menstruation is starting for them if they're not tracking it, whereas some do, even if they're not tracking it, because they can be like, I feel a bit anxious and, real low energy, and I've got a lot of cravings. I'm probably due my period in the next 2 to 3 or 4 days. You hear that quite a lot. But some females don't. They're just like, I started it today. Like they don't know, because those effects are just a lot less profound for them. So there is a massive range of responses to the menstrual cycle and how it affects you. So again, sometimes I'll be chatting about this and a girl will go, well, for me, and they just presume that therefore everyone else is like them. For me, I don't notice a difference. Everything's pretty consistent. Cool. That's great for you, but that isn't the case for everyone. Yeah. So for some of this information is kind of going to sit on a continuum of relevance and the potential, impactfulness that it will have depending on the individual.
What are some of the variables you think that can impact that?
A big one is genetics. So with people that have PMDD versus just PMS, there seems to be a different genetic response to how progesterone binds with the GABA receptor, which really affects mood. And that can also have an effect on whether birth control improves someone's mood and anxiety, or actually in some people, it makes it a lot worse. So obviously that's something that, again, you need to kind of be a little bit in tune with and speak to your doctor about and kind of figure out. I think, again, I said this earlier because it's so true. So many girls are put on birth control at such a young age that they don't realize that they may be a little bit depressed and anxious versus how they would be and how they were. And they don't know that it's birth control causing that because they've been on it for, 10,
just becomes the norm
years.
for them.
It's just their norm. Yeah, they don't know. So one thing I do when I start working with a new female client, because this is very much an area which, as a guy, I don't really want to talk to them too much about, but I'm very aware of.
You don't want to be preachy.
Yeah, exactly. Because obviously there's a lot of legitimate reasons for taking birth control. Obvious one being contraception, but also it does decrease the risk of certain cancers, increases the risk of others. And it's not, that isn't a decision that just affects you, that obviously affects your other half, et cetera, et cetera. So how I'll always approach that is if they say they're on birth control on my intake form or the copper IUD or whatever it is, I send them a couple of articles. I've got ones that I like by Dr. Lara Bryden. And I'm like, I will never bring this up with you again unless you ask me to and reply to. But just since you've ticked that box, please just read these. And if you want to chat to me about it after, about maybe coming off or not, or have questions about it, we can do that. But if you want to read them and then go, I'm still happy being on it and I don't want to chat to you about that, that's absolutely fine. Not once have any of my female clients then read those and then not gone, thank you for that. That was interesting. I didn't know that. And about half of them then go, do you think you can help me come off? So a lot of females don't realize they're only fertile 6 or 7 days a month. I did one of my little quizzes on Insta stories. Can you get pregnant any day of the month outside of your period? And I don't remember the exact numbers, but the majority said yes.
Really?
You're only fertile for 6 or 7 days, or you're fertile for less than that, but sperm can survive for a few days. So, if you have sex just before ovulation, then that might still cause, pregnancy. But so it's a 6 or 7 day window. So if you're very good at tracking, you can use the fertility awareness method with a very high degree of accuracy anyway, but most females kind of don't know that. So yeah, that's just one specific example kind of in terms of, birth control, the effects that it can have on mood and just how I approach it. And again, if any male coaches are listening, that's maybe what I'd recommend. So you're very much saying like, I'm aware that, you might not want to talk to me about this as a guy and it's out of my scope as a fitness professional, but I wouldn't be doing my job. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't just bring some awareness to this from a female doctor. You can read it from a female doctor. She's a doctor and a female.
I'm just the messenger.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know what you don't know. So it's my job to inform you of that. Yep, I think a lot of coaches very much stay in their comfort zone. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a doctor and I'm not female, but I'm not going to not pull on resources from females and or doctors to help with subjects that may be very, that may have a very large effect on why someone's coming to me. If they're coming to me going, I'm unhappy, I've got low mood, and that's part of their goal is to improve that, then 3 months later, they might be a bit happier, they've lost some weight, they're a bit healthier. But if overall their mood is still really bad, that reflects badly on me. I've done them a disservice because they didn't achieve their goals. And if the underlying reason was birth control for them, how it affects them from a genetic standpoint, is it really affects their mood, and I didn't bring that up and try and inform them on that, then that's my problem. That's not their problem.
Yep. Have you had females come off birth control and then decide to go back on within 3 to 6 months because things have taken too long to balance out, things haven't improved, or they just essentially feel better taking birth control?
I've had 2 off the top of my head that, yes, have done that. One was for her skin. It did get bad afterwards, which is potentially a problem. This is the thing on birth control, just quickly to kind of help with the context of that question, is it doesn't balance your hormones. Just like if a guy takes testosterone, it doesn't balance your hormones. You stop your own internal production because you're taking an exogenous source. Because you're taking synthetic progesterone and or estrogen externally, you don't get some of the symptoms that may come with those high or low states naturally. But you're not fixing the underlying problem when you come off, which you're most probably going to do eventually if you want to get pregnant. All those problems are going to still be there, and some, because some of those problems, for example, heavy menses, heavy periods, those estrogen receptors get overwhelmed when you come off, just like when you go through puberty, and they can be very heavy. We can suppress the underlying reasons why you can have hormonal acne, and that can rebound even worse. So yeah, it doesn't fix the underlying.
What is that, sorry?
You can
hormonal
acne if you're taking it for your skin, which then the rebound effect can be worse initially. So it's one of those where it's like, if you're already on it, what do you do with that information? Coming off probably isn't going to be great for a few months. There is a lot of stuff you can do for that. It's known as post-birth control syndrome. The syndrome just meaning, for anyone that doesn't know, just like IBS or PCOS, it's not a specific diagnosis. And people say, I've got PCOS, I've got IBS, well, what type? And they're like, I don't know. Right. That's not a diagnosis. A syndrome just means a collection of symptoms, which can't be diagnosed with another definition. So there's kind of different types or different root causes or different subcategories. So 2 women coming off birth control wouldn't have the same post-birth control syndrome. Your skin might get bad, your periods might get heavy, you might gain a little bit of body fat, your mood might get worse. You don't know. There's a lot of variables to this. But what females kind of do, which make all of that worse, and people in general do, but in particular females, is, and this is some stuff I know we're going to chat about, is they're on very low calories. They've always got the stress of overtraining and dieting. They're
eating.
They're micronutrient deficient because, and this is something I know we're going to chat about, you can't physically eat all of your micronutrient targets for the day on less than 1900 calories. The maths just doesn't add up. So you now have this huge disconnect between females dieting, and this is why females have so many problems dieting that guys don't, is just the number of calories they have to diet on, and that goes below the energy availability threshold. And by default, if you reverse engineer it, you're not getting insufficient fats, carbs, proteins, micronutrients. So you've got these girls coming off birth control, and then it's this quite sad situation where they're just not healthy because they're doing all of this stuff or not doing all of this stuff, and that makes it a lot worse. The last client I had come off birth control, we basically want to lay like a foundational protocol. So I was like, let's come off in 2 or 3 months. Let's get you as healthy as we can first. We've got calories to, off the top of my head, I think 2,400 on a training day, 2,200 on a rest day. She also had follicular and luteal phase splits, which is a bit more advanced and not relevant for most people, but different targets for different phases of her cycle. And we just ensured that she was managing stress. We were just doing everything we could possible to get her as healthy as possible. mostly by reverse dieting calories up and therefore getting in sufficient food and sufficient micros. She came off birth control and absolutely zero problems.
Yep.
Her cycle was actually back on the next one, which is quite rare. Normally that takes a few cycles, just absolutely fine. And again, there's a lot of genetic stuff to that for sure, but she was just as healthy as you could possibly be in terms of ticking those daily boxes: sleep, stress management, sufficient calories, etc., not overtraining. No post-birth control.
I was going to say, I'd make an assumption that you probably, because most females are also addicted to like the cardio and the high intensity interval training.
Yeah,
so
no hit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd imagine that you'd like kind of reduce that stuff right back or cut it all out altogether and focus more on resistance training as you go through reverse dieting. Let's build a little bit of muscle. Let's get the metabolism firing. Yeah. It's a complex subject, man, but this is why we need to discuss it, right? There's so many things that go on. And if you're, we've spoken about this before, like offline, like adding stress on top of stress, man, like the stress is linked to so many like health implications in the Western world. And, we need to manage stress as much as we can in all areas of life. Yeah. So a couple of things there. You spoke about the follicular luteal phase. Let's go through the menstrual cycle and then let's talk about what's happening in those phases hormonally, some of the emotions that might be experienced at different times, when you might be able to push training, when you're going to need to pull back, when you need to maybe eat a little bit more, when you need to manage your macronutrients and dial everything in, when you can be a little bit looser, et cetera, because everything's connected, right? So let's go through that process, talk my audience and myself through the phases.
Yeah, great. So a quick thing kind of around the research on the menstrual cycle, if that's okay, because
absolutely,
what a lot of the time, not so much the everyday Gen Pop girl probably isn't reading studies, but some are, and some coaches will say to me, I read this study and it said that, the menstrual cycle didn't impact strength levels, for example. And what we need to understand about research is that you need a control and you need a variable. The variable is the outcome, but the menstrual cycle itself is a huge variable. And we'll get into some of those in a second, but we have the length of it, what phase that they are in. In the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, progesterone should be the dominant hormone over estrogen, but it isn't always. A lot of girls experience this umbrella term of estrogen dominance. Some might have oligomenorrhea, so an inconsistent cycle there for whatever reason. They're just overstressed, too lean, PCOS. Some are missing it altogether. Some are on birth control, menopause, et cetera, which means that because there are so many variables to even a healthy cycle and the individual range of what a healthy cycle means, let alone an unhealthy cycle, it's very, very hard to take that into account with research because it's a variable and the outcome is also a variable. And then people just read the abstract. And one of the most famous studies that kind of went around for why you shouldn't just read the abstract was on birth control. And the abstract was, we concluded that birth control did not impact body composition, which it kind of doesn't, and it doesn't by much. There's obviously a lot of other variables there that impact body composition. But one woman in the study had lost 70 pounds. Had lost 35 pounds, and one woman had gained 70 pounds over a year. So anytime you look at a study, right, you get that bell curve. You get the majority of people kind of sit in the middle, and then it kind of tapers off, and then you get those outliers. But those outliers often skew the average, or can mean that the average is nothing. But actually, that doesn't mean there wasn't a huge response to how that affected individuals. And again, we're in the business of working with individuals. It's called personal training. I'm not in the business of working with averages. Mm-hmm. So, another great example is there's a few muscle gain studies where people have lost muscle. They want to compare a high frequency to a low frequency split, and some people have lost muscle. There's fat loss studies where people have gained fat. So that really skews the averages, and often there'll then be kind of like another part which they'll say we'll take the outliers out or whatever. But the point is, again, that the menstrual cycle is so many variables in it, which we'll get to, or lack of it, or health, variations of it. And then you have, even within a normal healthy menstrual cycle, it can be between 21 and 35 days. So like, how do you factor that into the outcome of a study? That's a huge range. And then most people just read the abstract.
And the other thing we need to think about is like, how are these studies being conducted as well? For the most part, like, I'd imagine something like that is done through a survey.
Yeah.
And you can't control like any of the other variables. You can't just look at one variable and be like, oh, well, when this happens, it's not cause and effect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, mate. A lot of them are surveys. So then we need to look at what is the research. Is Is it a meta-analysis? Is it a random control trial? Is it in a lab? For sure. So, and they're kind of basic terms that coaches should be kind of familiar with, so that when they are trying to understand a topic a bit, they kind of can go, yeah, this study maybe has more validity than another study. And I'm a huge fan of Examine for that, for coaches. I think I pay like $20 a month. It's nothing, and it does an amazing job of
just for the audience, that's examine.com.
Yeah. So would recommend. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of the problem with the studies and the research done on this, in terms of then, okay, well, it doesn't seem to affect this much or that much, so then people don't do anything about it. So really what we need females to do is kind of be their own scientist, ideally. So to just quickly talk you through the process of how I do that before we get into the menstrual cycle, is I'll have female clients track their menstrual cycle, because a lot don't. And I used to use like Flow or Clue, one of those apps, and they were good. And then I was like, there's a few problems with this. One, there isn't a coach's dashboard section where I can view my client's data. And two, it's very much aimed at just getting pregnant or preventing pregnancy, and some education around things like PMS, which is all great stuff, but they weren't aimed at athletes. And by athlete, I don't mean what most people would perceive to be an athlete. If you train on purpose and you train hard 4 times a week, you're an athlete, because that is a massive amount of stress on the body, which most people just, again, don't kind of understand how relevant that is. So you're an athlete. I don't care if you're actually a mortgage broker. If you're my client and I'm training you 4 times a week, you're an athlete. And we need to take that into account. So I actually started having the wireframes for an app made to make an app like that. And then someone's done it and it's great. So that's a bit annoying. But anyway, it's good that it's out there now. And it's called Wild AI. It's a great app. It links with the Aura Ring now, which is awesome for some reasons we can get into. So I've literally just started playing around with that app now. But before I was using Clue or Flow. And what we do is we track the cycle for typically 2 cycles. The reason being is, one, that could just be random. That doesn't necessarily give us any consistent picture. If a client does come to me and they have been tracking their cycle very consistently and they kind of know a bit about it, we might be able to go straight in pretty much from day one, being proactive in, some strategies, taking into account the menstrual cycle, whether that's training or nutrition. But for the most part, with most clients, it's probably unnecessary extra stress initially. There's so many other low-hanging fruit that they need to get into the habit of doing, that I'd kind of put the menstrual cycle down a few notches for most people, and again, depending on what it is we're talking about. So typically we'd still go through 2 months where we're maybe not being proactive, but I am trying to educate them on it a little bit, and we're maybe being a bit reactive.
Yeah, just connecting the dots with you know, what's going on, where they are in the cycle, how they're feeling, what emotions are coming up, how they're feeling in the gym with training, stress levels, etc., etc. Yeah, that's cool, man.
And then we'll jump on a call after 2 cycles, kind of evaluate that, and then start to maybe be a bit proactive. Again, the exceptions to that are clients that are coaches, which kind of have the prerequisites to be consistent. I think people don't put enough importance on setting yourself up to win from a consistency standpoint. If you're struggling to be consistent and you're not hitting your daily protein target and you're sleeping 6 hours a night, etc., you do not need to change your macros in your training program about the menstrual cycle. You just don't. You're setting yourself up to fail. That's unnecessary stress, and it's unnecessarily complicated. So, but I do have about 50% of my clients are other coaches, which is great. So sometimes I will, from day one, they have that data, they have the prerequisites of consistency and knowledge, and we're into taking that into account. So again, it depends. You've got to treat this person like an individual. But then getting into the menstrual cycle itself, so that's kind of how I approach it. So the menstrual cycle itself, I think a lot of females freak out when it's not 28 days because they believe that's what it should be. 28 days is just the average between 21 and 35, which is the range of what's deemed to be a healthy menstrual cycle. I think it's only 20 to 30% of females that actually have a 28-day cycle. So yeah, don't freak out if yours is 32 or whatever. And it changing a little bit month to month within that range is also deemed as normal. So that's kind of the overview of the cycle. It doesn't have a start date and an end date because obviously it's an ongoing cycle, at least from puberty to menopause. But
doesn't work with the calendar.
Yeah, exactly. So typically what's called is we say it's 28 days for a normal average cycle. We then have the follicular phase, which is the first half, the luteal, which is the second half. So the follicular phase is from day 1 of menses, day 1 of the period, until ovulation occurring. So again, if it is a 28-day cycle, that is probably 14 days. And then ovulation occurring to the last day before menses is then the luteal phase, which again, in theory, would be about 14 days. And then within that, we kind of have the early follicular, the late follicular, early luteal, late luteal, which again are typically 7 days each if it's a 28-day cycle. Some people will, and there's validity to it, especially from a training standpoint, refer to the early follicular phase as however long menstruation lasts, however long the period lasts, which kind of makes sense because it's when that starts finishing that the estrogen starts increasing again the most. So you might only have a 3-day period, and then that early follicular phase, you know, for you is kind of 3 days from a training standpoint of when you might start feeling a lot better, a lot stronger, recovering more. So those kind of two terms can be used interchangeably. Some people say the early follicular phase is, again, 7 days based on that average normal cycle. Some people will say it's however long menses last, which is typically 3 to 5 days.
Okay. So just for the audience, I'm just thinking out loud here. Could we break this down into simpler terms and say there's 2 phases? Phase 1 is going to be part A, part B, part C. And then the same thing with phase 2. A, B, C, early, A and B?
Early and late.
Okay, cool. So part 1 or phase 1, part A, B, phase 2, A, B.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
That works.
Perfect. Let's talk about what's going on from a physiological standpoint within each of those phases.
Cool.
And the associated effects of that.
Yeah. So the easiest way of explaining this, in my opinion, is actually starting with ovulation. Because the whole point of the menstrual cycle is for reproduction to occur. I know that sounds kind of a bit reductionist, so I apologize, but from a physiological sense, that's what it is, right? But even if you don't care about reproduction, you know, right now, whatever, there's a lot of other functions of progesterone and estrogen that we need to care about, which is why if you have lost your menstrual cycle from being too lean and or overtraining, over dieting, that is a problem we need to care about, whether you want, you know, to reproduce or not.
Yep.
So
that's typically a sign of like overstress, right? Like your body's literally going, hey, I can't support another life right now because I'm struggling to support my own life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So whenever we refer to stress, just quickly, like when we're talking about stress, you know, as you know, but for the audience, a lot of people just go stress. Oh, lifestyle stress. I'm not stressed. You know, there's 4 categories of stress. We have physical, so, you know, training, injuries, etc. Physiological. If you had, I don't know, a digestive problem like candida or whatever it might be, you know, being on medications places a physiological stress on the body. Psychological. So then that is, you know, your lifestyle stress, etc., etc. And past trauma and depression kind of then takes its own category, which I'm not an expert in, but a lot of the time that isn't at the surface. You don't feel like it's affecting you day to day, but it's obviously very much still there. So the definition of stress is just anything that throws the body out of balance. Okay, we obviously have that stress response. We end up in that sympathetic state of our nervous system. That's a training session, just like it's arguing with your boss, just like it's having anxiety about something else. You know, it's
the
all
kids
the same.
Playing up at school, you got financial issues, etc., etc.
It's all the same physiological response: increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood sugar levels, etc., etc.
Which ties into like HPA axis dysfunction, right? Which is something we'll dive into later on.
Yeah, exactly. And that you can line that up next to the HPO for ovaries and literally look across it going, that inhibits that stops the production of that. And that is why we stop producing the sex hormones. So yeah, starting at ovulation, starting a little back from ovulation, when estrogen surges just before ovulation, and its role is to grow the endometrial lining. So it starts really surging. If you look at it, for most people, just as menses is about to start finishing or just as your period's finished, estrogen will start surging. It kind of makes this last ditch attempt to surge, and it does that by converting any extra progesterone and testosterone available back into E2, which is, there's 3 estrogens. So, but to keep it simple, there's estrogen. E2 is the one that it pulls testosterone and progesterone into E2. So there's as much estrogen as possible to kind of have this last minute surge, growing the endometrial lining as much as possible, ready for ovulation to occur. When those estrogen levels reach a certain point, that sends a positive feedback loop up to the pituitary gland in your brain, which just goes, hey, we're ready to release an egg, endometrial lining's good. Pituitary gland goes, sweet, we'll send down some LH, some luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation. One follicle was chosen, it's known as the Graafian follicle. That releases its egg. And then, you know, pregnancy may or may not occur. So again, we have this window a couple of days before ovulation because sperm can still survive, and then a couple of days after until obviously that egg dies. Gotcha. So then that estrogen drops off, the luteinizing hormone drops off. When the body realizes that pregnancy didn't occur, it kind of gets ready to start this whole process again. So then we start to get an increase in estrogen again in the second half of the cycle, still less than the first half and still less than progesterone, but the progesterone starts to really increase. And that's because there's this little part of the egg called the corpus luteum, which produces progesterone. And this is important to know because we do produce a little bit of progesterone in the ovaries and the adrenals. So there's a little bit in the first half of the cycle, but the surge comes from releasing that egg. Now, a lot of females don't know that you can have a period without ovulating. Just because you're having a period does not mean ovulation's occurred. And there's a good handful of times where I've started working with a new client. They have all the symptoms of low progesterone, the big one being PMS, and those kind of symptoms, you know, mood, fatigue, etc., especially in the second half, of the cycle where you should have that surge of progesterone. We check to make sure ovulation's occurring. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. The easiest one, if possible, is with bloods when ovulation in theory should be occurring. And obviously you'll see the levels of luteinizing hormone, which again is the signal to trigger ovulation.
And this is also why it's important to track. So you've got that data. You can have an understanding of like when you should be due, when you're in different phases of the period. So then you can check your hormones at that time.
Exactly. Depending on the goal of the bloods.
Gotcha.
So if the goal of the bloods is to make sure ovulation is occurring, you have a very small window to obviously get that measurement. So that's one way. If bloods aren't an option or they're a bit too expensive, we can use ovulation strips, which you urinate on. That will tell you if there's luteinizing hormone in there. And we also can take body temperature. Body temperature can be a good reading to take because not only does it tell us if ovulation has occurred, because it jumps up by about 0.5 degrees, it also tells us how long the phases are. And if month to month, if the length of the phases are changing, which is good data because if they are changing a lot, then that again is potentially a sign that the body is going, okay, in theory, we should ovulate today. Estrogen's going, yes, we're good to ovulate, but the pituitary gland's going, actually, no, I'm perceiving too much stress.
Not quite ready
external or internal. Yeah, we need to delay that. And that can happen a lot. So estrogen's going, hey, yeah, we're ready. And the pituitary gland's going, no, but we're not actually. The bigger picture of our body is not.
I'm just going to pause you there at the door there.
Yeah.
Not going to let you in yet.
Yeah, we're not ready. We're stressed or whatever it might be. So body temperature is a cool one because then we take it every morning and it tells us the length of each phase as well as if ovulation's occurred. The downside of it is you have to take it every morning and it's a bit of effort. But that, again, as I mentioned earlier, is one reason why the Aura Ring is awesome, is obviously it takes that basically 24/7. So it's one less thing to have to worry about doing. Syncs with that Wild AI app.
Does that take your body temperature?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Body temperature, respiratory rate, heart rate variability. And of course, the sleep stages. And because the menstrual cycle, as we'll get to, does affect a lot of those numbers I just spewed off that we'll explain, it's great to have that consistent, data and not have to worry about putting a heart rate monitor on every morning or taking your body temperature or whatever it might be. So anyway, they're the three ways that we can measure if ovulation has occurred. And as I said, I wouldn't say it's that common, but I'd say a good 30 to 50% of the time when I start working with a new female client that has these symptoms of low progesterone, again, the big one being bad PMS, ovulation isn't actually occurring. And therefore because they're not releasing the egg, we don't then get that increase in progesterone in the second half of the cycle like we should. And that does two things. One, we don't have the progesterone. And two, it means we have this estrogen dominance term, which some people have heard of. Estrogen dominance doesn't have to mean we're producing too much estrogen. It can just mean that there's too much relative to progesterone. So estrogen is higher than progesterone.
Right,
when
so it's more about the ratios.
Yes, it could be about the ratios. It could be that we're not detoxifying it properly in the liver. It could be that it's getting unpackaged in the gut before we can excrete it in our stools if we have digestive problems. It could be that we're not going to the toilet regularly enough and it's recirculating because we eliminate estrogen in our stools. So these are the kind of questions that I ask on my intake form is some symptoms of like a burdened, sluggish liver if they have PMS and estrogen dominance, because they might not be able to detoxify estrogen properly and it's recirculating, or digestive symptoms and problems, which means it's recirculating and just frequency that they're going to the toilet. So they're three things that like I would definitely be looking into, if I was a female and I was struggling with this estrogen dominance and or low progesterone causing my PMS. That is the cause of PMS, then it kind of like needs to go through this little bit of a flowchart process going, okay, bad PMS in the second half of the cycle is the problem. Low energy, anxiety, high cravings, that's the problem. Okay, it's either estrogen dominance and or low progesterone. Let's check if ovulation's occurring to see if it's low progesterone. And okay, do I have any issues potentially with my liver, my gut, or going for a poo at least once a day and it being healthy? And then you can start to support that area. So, you know, sometimes with new clients intake form, there's a lot of signs of the liver, you know, not being particularly being sluggish. Then maybe not producing bile. They have an inability to digest fats. They eat foods with fat in it. They feel very sluggish, bloated. They see, fat in their stools. Maybe they have a very sensitive to alcohol or the smell of chemicals, blood sugar dysfunction problems like, you know, energy crashes, etc. That could all be symptoms that the liver is kind of overburdened and a bit sluggish. And then you can start to address the actual root cause of the PMS, because all doctors typically do is go, well, you've got PMS, it's because of high estrogen and or low progesterone, so let's just get rid of those and give you the pill, which again doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Yeah. That's what I meant earlier when I said, you know, taking birth control balances. Yeah. Because that's how it's explained when doctors prescribe that.
Balances and regulates, but it just doesn't. So yeah, sometimes in the second half of the cycle, we should have the progesterone higher than the estrogen, and we don't.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about just tying back into the two main phases of the cycle, and then the early phase, late phase in both each individual phase. What should be occurring? Like if someone has a healthy menstrual cycle, what should be occurring and what should they be feeling? What are the things they're looking for to kind of give them an indication that things are working well? We'll talk about that first, and then we'll come back to things that, you know, may be signs that something is not quite right, what to look for, and then how to address that.
Yeah. So the question would actually kind of be the other way around.
Okay.
It would be not much.
Okay.
And again, there is a genetic component to that, but for the most part, the female clients I've got that are on the most calories, that aren't overtraining, that are really healthy, we maybe addressed specific problems such as constipation or their gut or their liver, they don't notice much. And that's kind of how it should be. Mm-hmm. Sure, there is always going to be, for example, an increase in metabolic rate in the luteal phase. Mm-hmm. Because
is that significant enough to speak about?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So this is when we've got this estrogen and progesterone, as we've touched on. So we have both in both phases, but only a tiny bit of progesterone in the first half, right? Mm-hmm. So estrogen is the dominant hormone in phase 2 or phase B. Progesterone should be dominant over estrogen. And progesterone is catabolic in nature. Estrogen is anabolic. So progesterone breaks things down. Estrogen builds things up. So think about, estrogen, you go through puberty, girls start growing boobs. Guys jump on a testosterone cycle. They don't manage their estrogen because estrogen goes up in proportion to testosterone. You know, they start getting gyno, for example, right? So that's how I remember that. So progesterone is now the dominant hormone in the second half of the cycle. And because that is catabolic, it breaks tissue down. We do have potentially a higher risk of obviously not being able to recover from sufficient amounts of training in comparison to the first half of the cycle. So now you might do a little bit less volume, and or you might do a little bit less training, which is geared towards muscle damage. So you might not spend as long in the eccentric phase, or you might not use techniques which take you past failure in the eccentric phase, for example. And because progesterone is catabolic, we do get that slight increase in metabolic rate, which brings with it the increase in core body temperature. Mm-hmm. It's around 5 to 15%. And how you might figure out what end of the spectrum you sit at there, if you don't have access to like a proper gaseous exchange chamber to measure your metabolic rate accurately in each phase of the cycle, which obviously most people don't, you would kind of ask the question, how much do you feel your hunger and appetites and need and energy levels change between cycles? Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's other variables to that, but if we can kind of control those kind of like lifestyle and sleep and stress variables between both phases, then the big change which is left is the amount of progesterone. So if someone goes, in the second half of my cycle, I do have less energy, I don't want to do as much NEAT, my hunger is higher, my cravings are higher, they probably sit on the higher end of that 5 to 15% range that metabolic rate is increasing by. And obviously, if they're kind of like, I don't really notice too much of a difference, maybe a couple of days before my period, I'm a bit hungry or whatever, they're probably sitting on the lower end. So when it comes to then setting clients up with their calories, I typically do take that into account and give them slightly more calories in that luteal phase. Because, why not? It probably already calculated for the most part the maximum deficit that you want them in if they have a fat loss goal, and subsequently probably not going to want to make that more and kind of set them up to fail by maybe making the hunger and cravings worse than they already are kind of in that luteal phase. So sometimes for that whole, phase B, not luteal phase, the second half. So yeah, I might have about 5 to 15% increase there. And remember that obviously there we're looking at BMR. So not overall maintenance calories, just BMR, which for most females is 11 to 1300. So take 10% for easy maths, because I'm not very good at maths. If we just go in the middle at 10%, say a female kind of calculates based on her weight and age that her BMR is 1200 calories, you would have an extra 120 calories per day in the second half of that cycle. And then if the hunger and cravings and which fall under the symptoms of PMS are really bad, which kind of happens in that late luteal phase, so the end of the second half for typically 2, 3, 5 days, that is when I might use a whole diet break where we come back up to maintenance calories. And there's some other benefits of that in terms of periodizing nutrition, which we've touched on as well. But just to kind of offset the cravings, because say they have a 30-day cycle for easy maths, I'd much rather they make 25 days of great progress, 5 days at maintenance. You're not getting fat, it's just maintenance calories. And if they gain a little bit of weight, it's super important for females to know that's not body fat if you've done this right. It's just we're now topping up glycogen stores a little bit. We're retaining a bit more water. There's a bit more undigested waste. So yeah, that might have a tiny weight increase, but you're not going to gain body fat. But most importantly, what we've done is we've got through it, so to speak.
Yeah,
and now we can
minimize the damage.
Exactly. We can rinse and repeat that monthly. Whereas a lot of females go into it, their hunger, cravings, they're on low calories already. They're restricting foods. They're using pure discipline and willpower. They're training hard because they don't adjust their training to that late luteal phase, which again, some don't need to, but some should. And whether it's before, period starts, or whether it's when the period starts, which also then has some of the same symptoms in the sense that progesterone and estrogen is still low there, it hasn't started coming back up yet. But then you throw in the potential period cramps or migraines or whatever that brings, then they really go, fuck it, right? And often massively binge. I'd much rather you had an extra 500-600 calories per day for 3, 5, 6 days at maintenance and it was controlled versus trying to stick with your deficit and binging, which probably results in more calories anyway. But also, and arguably more importantly, one forms a healthy relationship with food where you're in control and one food is controlling you, and that isn't sustainable. So that...
Yeah, I was going to say that creates a psychological association there.
Yes. Yeah, and now you're starting
to hate other problems.
Yeah, and now you're starting to hate your menstrual cycle and resent it instead of feeling empowered to work with it. So I kind of call that was 25-5, for example, if they had a 30-day cycle, 25-5, diet break strategy or whatever it might be. So that's kind of one example of something that you will notice even if your cycle is healthy and happy, as the progesterone does in the second half bring that increase in metabolic rate. Again, you probably won't recover quite as well. And what you'll actually find is what the progesterone does do, though, is it does increase VO2 max a little bit. So in people that are pushing the boundaries of that, so more kind of long distance endurance work, which isn't the majority of people me and you train, but if you are doing that type of training, you might notice an improvement in the second half of the cycle for that. Whereas generally speaking, the rest of your performance from a strength, coordination, intra-set recovery, so recovery between sets and recovery between sessions, estrogen's going to be beneficial for that. And subsequently, that is going to be a bit better in the first half of the cycle. So you'll still kind of notice that change between performance a little bit and between hunger and appetite and cravings maybe a little bit from the phases of the cycle. Again, how profound that's going to be is going to be slightly genetic, slightly what are you dieting versus are you at maintenance calories? Because that makes obviously a big difference to recovery. That makes a big difference to hunger and cravings. And again, it's important to know that, because a lot of kind of girls hear this and they run away with it. And it's like, well, if you're at maintenance calories, then, your performance is going to be better in your luteal phase in phase 2. It's probably going to be better than if you were dieting versus your performance in phase 1. Because even though your hormonal profile is better in phase 1 versus phase 2 for strength training and resistance training and muscle growth, the hormonal profile is only one snapshot of what affects strength and performance and recovery. Obviously, calorie intake.
And that hormonal profile is not going to be optimized if you are in a calorie deficit and you are potentially nutrient deficient in some areas. And Yeah, gotcha.
Exactly.
All right, so many things that come into play here.
Yeah, so we need to take into account the basically, are you dieting or not, calorie intake, as well as some other variables such as stress and sleep. You know, one girl might have a really stressful 2 weeks at work in the first half of her cycle, and she's actually sleeping better and less stressed in the second half of her cycle, even though in theory that shouldn't be happening from a hormonal standpoint, but just that month her lifestyle happens to line up, you know, the other way around. So again, this is where girls ideally kind of need to be their own scientists with it a little bit, just understand that the menstrual cycle is one variable, calorie intake, obviously, you know, quality of food, macros and micros, stress and sleep are kind of the other big ones, which are going to affect mood, energy, performance, and recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome, man. That's a really excellent way of wrapping that portion up. What I do want to move on to next is you just spoke about females being their own, would you say their own scientists? Yeah, let's talk about that. What are some, if people are listening right now and they're like, all right, this seems really interesting, I want to dive into this in a lot more detail to figure out like what my body's doing, so then I can start planning my days, I can start planning my nutrition, I can start planning my training, I can start, you know, managing stress, optimizing hormones, working with my life physiology. Like where do we start with that?
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of things to unpack here.
Well, I'd say it's a relatively short answer for the most part, to be honest. It's, as we kind of touched on already, it all starts with tracking it. You know, you can't manage and be reactive to and understand what you're not measuring.
You can't change what you're not unaware of.
Yeah, exactly. So it starts with tracking it. I said I would now recommend checking out the wild.ai app. You can keep using Flow or Clue or anything that you're already using, but check that out as well for something which is a little bit more aimed at athletes. Again, athletes being anyone that trains on purpose.
Yep.
And then consider, if you can, buying an Aura ring to go with it. You know, this is about £200, which is a lot of money up front, but you know, you get however many years and years and years of use out of it. It works out to be a very small monthly cost. And obviously the data is only as good as how consistently you do it, as you know. And the reality is a lot of quote unquote Gen Pop clients, they either don't want to and or forget or just make excuses for, you know, we've chatted about this loads before in coaches developments. Both of us have chatted when we've been teaching them about the importance of tracking that stuff. And it is super important. But we also have to then weigh up the cost of it, the cost being financial, of course, buying it. But more what I mean by that is the cost from a stress standpoint of actually having to do it, remembering to do it, and then also putting that information in, for example, my Excel check-in sheet. So if you can buy something which just takes it 24/7 and you don't need to do anything, you don't need to put a blood pressure cuff on.
Screenshot it.
Yeah, exactly. Or with Wild AI, as a coach, I can now add you as a client and I can view that from the coach's dashboard, which again is why that's great. And I'm going to get stuck into that app a bit more. But yeah, before it would just be that my clients would send me print screens off their Aura ring or whatever it is that they're using, the Elite HRV app. So now we can see, again, a good amount of data. It's tracked all of the time. And especially if you sync it with that app, you don't even need to put it anywhere. And then what you can kind of do is, all right, that's one half of it. That's that variable side of it. And then the other variable is whatever it is you want to improve, right? Strength, performance, managing your mood, whatever it might be. So then, well, how do we do that? Obviously, it's going to depend on, for example, if it's training, it's quite simple. You logbook, you know, you write your numbers down. You write the numbers down. You also make a bit of a note of how you feel in the session, maybe some videos from a coordination standpoint as well. If some of the lifts are more, you know, complex, and you reevaluate, you know, put time in your diary for 30 minutes once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, to then just kind of reevaluate and draw these conclusions. Yeah. If what we're trying to do is more mood kind of related stuff or appetite or cravings, then that's just kind of journaling, you know, in the morning or the end of the day or whatever, just spend a few minutes kind of being like, how do I feel, you know? And I kind of think for the most part, it's as simple as that. Obviously more specific, advanced cases.
It sounds really simple for us. And I mean, like the simple way that I'd like to explain it to people is you're literally just connecting the dots. You're connecting this data and you're going, all right, this is where I'm at in my cycle. This is how I slept. This is, you know, my hunger levels. This is how I feel. This is my energy levels. You know, like this is my mood. This is my attitude. And you're paying attention to all of these different variables and then you're like putting it together. So you've got a snapshot. So the next month, if you're on whatever, let's use that 30-day cycle again. You're on day 17. All right, on day 17 last month, I felt like this. these are all the variables that were going on. Day 17 this month, I felt like this. These are the variables. Okay, a lot of those variables are a lot different, so I can't use that as an accurate comparison, right? Then the next month, all right, cool. Month 1 and month 3, those variables are much more comparable. So now I've got some data to show what I'm typically going to be feeling like at that stage of my cycle.
Exactly that, mate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that, it allows you to set you up to win.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a client, for example, that's training with a personal trainer, and the personal trainer's going progressive overload. Great. That is correct. But for guys, in theory, we can probably progressively overload weekly.
Mm-hmm.
Females might not be able to. So if they do notice a decrease in strength in that second half of the cycle, and then, you as the coach may be getting a little bit annoyed, the client's getting annoyed, or just, you're a girl training yourself, you're getting a bit annoyed because you're not beating your logbook, it's getting worse, and you don't understand why, that's going to be very demotivating. Very, very demotivating. But I should be able to back squat this, or, I had an 8-week goal of getting this on my deadlift, and maybe that 8-week mark just happens to be the last 2 weeks of the second half of your cycle, or then you're like, I took a massive step backwards here, and that's really demotivating. But if you kind of go, okay, my progressive overload is going to happen 2 weeks of the month, the other 2 weeks my numbers might kind of be the same, maybe I'll, up a rep or something, but it may not happen, and that's okay, then you're setting yourself up to win, right? You're minimizing that frustration. The other one, as well as kind of the logbook and the weight you use or the reps you get at the weight, the other big and obvious one is scale weight.
Mm-hmm.
My female clients only weigh in once a month. Your lightest reading when water retention is at its lowest will typically be about 3 to 4 days after the period is finished. So that is when we'll weigh in and we'll keep it consistent. There is no point comparing a first half of the cycle to a second half of the cycle reading, especially your first weigh-in to your second weigh-in, because how demoralizing is that when you've been dieting hard for 2 weeks and then your scale weight has actually gone up.
Gotcha.
And then obviously that doesn't reflect well on anyone, and it's very demoralizing.
I'm sure there's different times when you're going to make different suggestions, right? Like some people are weighing every day. So in my opinion, like if they're one of those people, they weigh every day and you tell them, all right, we're only going to weigh once a month. Some people like that adds stress to them. They get freaked out, right? So then maybe you go, hey, I still want you to weigh every day, but I want you to connect the dots with this other data that you're collecting. This is where you are in your cycle. This is how you're feeling. These are those other variables we spoke about before. All right, I'm making an association with what's happening with my weight and these other variables. So then they can, it's like the same when, I'm talking to people about the effect of carbohydrates and glycogen storage and water retention. If people, are talking about losing weight or gaining weight over the weekend, they weigh in on a Friday and then they weigh in on Monday and like, oh man, I'm 1.5 kilos heavy. It's like, well, it's not fat. Like, did you eat a heap of carbohydrates or have a couple of beers on the weekend? Yeah, I did. All right, well, this is the case, blah, blah, blah. And then again, you educate them on that stuff so they can connect the dots, which, education breeds compliance, right? Like if people understand why they're doing something and they can understand, what's happening with these scale weight fluctuations with all these other lifestyle factors and nutrition and all that type of stuff, I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, for sure, mate. Yeah. I 100% agree with that. The specific example of the scale weight is when I might kind of, despite completely agreeing with that and that I would do that in other concepts, I still might not sometimes with the scale weight. The reason being is that if telling someone they are going to be weighing in once a month stresses them out, obviously you don't want to cause that stress, but I would then argue that we need to fix why that stresses them out, because that's not probably particularly healthy. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those where sometimes I won't even use the scale.
Then it comes back to like, where does that sit on the list of priorities?
Yeah, of course. So then you have to,
and that's why coaching is so fucking so complex, man.
Yeah, exactly. So I do have females that kind of push back against that, and sometimes I'll have to say to them, like, give me your scale if they're in person, or give it if they're online, give it to a friend, because if the temptation is there, then A, you're depleting that like willpower and discipline muscle every time you see the scale and you want to jump on it. B, you're potentially setting yourself up to fail if it doesn't kind of go in the right direction, and that's demoralizing. And by letting the client, what I'm trying to say here is by letting the client do it, you're potentially contradicting yourself a little bit, in my opinion. So what I'm maybe saying to them is, hey, the scale weight doesn't matter that much in general, because we want body composition, not weight, and because of this menstrual cycle stuff we've been chatting about. So that is what I'm telling you, but I'm not reinforcing it with my actions. If I'm going, but yeah, sure, you can still weigh in every day or once a week or whenever. I feel like that kind of doesn't line up. And then you're not as likely to get that adherence from the client because you're not being strong in that belief. Whereas if I'm like, I want you to bin that fucking scale, they're going, wow, okay, he really means that there is zero importance on this. And I need to then understand and change my beliefs around it. Whereas if I'm telling you that, but not backing it up with not my actions, but the actions I'm asking you to do, then that's kind of maybe a little bit contradictory, and you're not going to change that belief that the scale really, really matters. So a lot of the time I will be like, you're giving your scale to a friend, because especially if we have to use a reverse diet phase to start, which is another thing I don't know if we're going to chat about a little bit, where you need to focus on health first. Like sometimes people are so unhealthy and their calorie intake is so low that they don't have the prerequisites to start dieting. They're just setting them up to fail. And this is something that a lot more coaches are doing now, which is amazing. And it's something that I teach in my course, is we might need to do that for 4 weeks or 6 or 8 weeks first. But then you're kind of going, okay, the goal of this phase, is to eat more calories, improve, metabolism, get healthy, fix whatever specific fix. You're not broken, you're adapted. Fix whatever health issues you may have, which would vary person to person. But then you can't measure any of those outcomes with the scale. So then again, there's kind of a disconnect between what is the goal of the phase, and the scale can't actually measure your health or your metabolic rate improving by your thyroid speeding up or whatever. So then sometimes it isn't the right tool for the phase. And because even though you're telling the client, okay, this isn't a weight loss phase for the first 4 or 6 or 8 weeks, we need to get you healthy first, they'll be like, yeah, okay, I understand that. But they might not really understand it, and then by jumping on the scale and not seeing it going down, you're just kind of reinforcing to them that they're not actually achieving the goal that they want to achieve. So sometimes I might get a starting weight, and then I'm like, okay, we're going to be reverse dieting for 4 to 8 weeks first. We need to get you healthy. You've plateaued on 1,400 calories. We physically can't go into a deficit. The maths doesn't add up. We need to go up first so we can come back down, and therefore weight isn't going to go down. It's going to stay about the same. So therefore, we're just not going to use the scale. It's not the right tool. Get rid of it for a couple of months.
Yeah, completely client dependent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, fuck, man, this is something I've spoken about. Every time I've had other coaches on, we've had discussions around, the different tools that we've used with clients. Like how we apply those tools are completely different to every single person. Depending on their mindset and their already preconceived ideas. And, we need to prioritize what we're going to go into battle about, because we can't give our clients all of these tools and just expect them to follow that. We need to be able to adjust and go, all right, cool, I'm going to let you jump on the scale every day, but I want you to track and make these connections and have these associations, because it's very difficult to have that conversation with the client about, hey, like, you've created like metabolic adaptation and you're operating on very low calories. Like, we need to go through a reverse diet. We need to improve the health of the organism, because a healthy organism's an adaptable organism. We need to go through that process first. And it's hard to explain to particularly a female weight loss client that we need to go through that process. And hey, I know you want to lose weight, but for the next 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 months, depending on, how you came into this process, like, we're not going to be losing weight. We need to go through this reverse diet process. We need to bump your calories up. Your weight's going to stay the same, or maybe it might even bump up a little bit. Because we're going to change your training. We're going to put some, exactly. We're going to put a little bit of muscle on. We're going to add some strength. We're going to improve health, performance, functionality, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's hard to have those conversations with people. So, the point that I was making is, like, I totally understand where you're coming from, and like 100% agree with that, man. But then for, this is more for the coaches listening as well, is we need to find the tools that are going to work with our individual clients, and we need to find the things that we're willing to sacrifice with our clients on, or compromise with, and find the things that our clients are willing to compromise on us with, because we can't do everything at once, unfortunately. In a perfect world, absolutely. Duration. Yeah.
And like, as you said, a reverse diet can take that many months, but no one wants to do that.
Nope.
So the compromise for me is the duration. It's very rare I'll start a client on a reverse diet, which means it's, when we're talking about a 4-week time frame, it's technically not even really a reverse diet. But it's very rare I'll do it for more than 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Now, if you've lost your menstrual cycle, it's different. Okay, it's 5-6 months. We're not dieting. But if it's just optimizing the start point so that you have the runway ahead of you to actually achieve your end goal.
We're going to get you to the start line first.
Yeah, exactly. And one little tip for any coaches listening, that how I kind of do this is I feel like some visuals can really help with this. So when I'm on the call with a new client or they're about to sign up and I'm explaining this, I'll often kind of do a screen share, and I've got like a couple of things that I'll use. You've probably seen my little graphic where there's two people at the bottom of the mountain. One's got a huge backpack on, one doesn't. I've written goal physique at the top of the mountain and dieting journey is up it. Which one's going to have an easier time getting to the top? The person with the heavy backpack on might not even get there. And I'm like, say you spend 3 weeks taking that backpack off, you'll get up there faster, easier, and more efficient than if you just try to climb it with the backpack on. The backpack representing sluggish metabolism, digestive problems, low calorie intake, whatever it might be. And they're like, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So I've kind of got a few visuals that I use which help. And then I bring it back to them. I'm like, okay, so how did you feel the last 17 times that you finished a diet and rebounded? And I like, it sounds harsh, but I really get them to like pay into that. Like, you need to. If you're not in pain, you're not going to change. Yeah. So like, I really delve into like how they have felt every time they've kind of gone through these starvation diets or whatever, and how that they've, not enjoyed it and it's been difficult, and how they've missed out on social occasions and how they feel when they've rebounded. So then I really play into that. Like, we need to do this differently. And then I'll just quickly explain the concept of like to them how metabolism slows down when you diet. You can actually grow new fat cells if rate of fat gains fast enough. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. That's scary. And I'm like, yes, it is, which means we need to do it right this time. And if they're still not on board, then they're not the client for me, to be honest, because I'm not prepared to compromise your health and what I know you need to do. I will compromise on the duration or some aspects of it, but I'm not prepared to throw it out the window altogether. And the most I'll sometimes compromise is depending on the client and depending on the phase of their cycle they're in, if they have one, and a few other variables. Sometimes we will do a small diet first. I'm like, okay, you do understand this. You are prepared to reverse diet, but you just really don't like how you look and feel right now. Maybe depending on where they're at, they have 4 weeks of, I call it like runway. Maybe you have 4 weeks of runway ahead of you. So sure, let's diet for 4 weeks. I'm probably not going to make anything worse than it already is, or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Just get you dropping the first few pounds so you're feeling better, you're looking better. Then we'll go into what we need to do.
Yeah, because you're just giving them the tools to provide buy-in.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, this dude knows what he's talking about. Yeah, maybe I'll trust the process, man.
Yeah, exactly. And then, then we kind of go into the mini reverse diet to actually start the diet, which again, we might compromise on duration. It might be 4 to 8 weeks. Now we've built the runway where they can actually get to the finish line, which is maybe 12 or 16 weeks, whereas most people quit after 3 to 6 because they can't sustain it physiologically and psychologically. So now we've got the runway ahead of us. If the plane taking off represents achieving the goal, we've got enough runway ahead of us. They achieve the goal, then we go into the full reverse diet to cement it. So that's kind of how I go through that process. Is it's like some visuals to kind of help explain what's going on. I really home into like their pain points and get them to decide that they need to do it. It's always better if the client decides that that's what they want and need versus you telling them. Then I'll explain metabolic adaptation and growing new fat cells to them quickly and simply. Then if really needed, I might even compromise on a mini diet first, as well as compromising on the duration of the reverse diet. Because what often quite happens is people start reverse dieting and they go, do you know what, Leo? I feel so amazing. I've not got PMS anymore. I've not got this. I've not got that. Like, I do still really want to lose weight, but would it be more advantageous for me to carry this phase on for a little bit? Yeah. And then absolutely. I might say yes or no to that, depending on if it is or isn't. And then actually they might go for a little bit longer anyway, because they're like, wow, I really see that every time I've started a diet before in the past, it's been a struggle because I've been unhappy, unhealthy, and low energy starting the diet. Now I feel
restricting, using motivation, using willpower, and then after 4 to 6 weeks, like that's gone, and it's like boom, binge, fucking, all or nothing mindset.
So because people often don't remember how good they used to feel and therefore how bad they feel now, often when we compromise on a 4-week reverse diet to get us started, often they go, I do want to lose weight, but can we just do this for a little bit longer? Yeah. And I go, hey, do you know what? Actually, a few more weeks would be really beneficial. We've started to get calories up a bit. Maybe we've gone from 1,500 to 1,900. And I'm like, that's great. But the second we go into a deficit, we're back to that number. Okay, great. At least it is now a deficit and you're losing weight versus plateaued on that low number, but we're kind of back to square one. Whereas if we can get to 2,300 calories, then we're starting your diet on 19. And now when we reverse engineer the calories for how much food and how many of each macro and how many micros you can get, we're now starting the diet on a number which is just sufficient. Yeah. And that makes a massive difference.
It's still supporting health.
Yes, because this is why guys have an easier time dropping weight. If girls are maintaining weight on 2,000 calories per day, you remove that generic 500, you've got 1,500 calories. Let's put that to one side for a second. Let's look at the minimum amount of protein, fats, and carbs we want in a day for their roles and functions. And then you times that number by the 4, 4, and 9 calories, right? I've done a post on this if anyone wants to kind of see like what numbers might be right for them. Obviously, it does depend on your weight and your goal.
Can you send that to me afterwards?
Yeah,
that
for
link in the show notes?
Sure. Let's take a generic like 110 protein, 50 fat, and 160 carb, for example. You add those up, that comes to roughly off the top of my head, like 1,650 calories. So there's instantly this disconnect where we have to compromise on either the amount of fats or carbs, which then presents problems in the long run to be on the amount of calories you want to lose weight. Whereas guys don't need to do that, because if we're maintaining weight on, again, a generic 2,500, for example, we're starting the diet on 2,000. So not only do we have to compromise one macro, which then can present problems, most people compromise carbs. And what actually happens in females, which is kind of crazy, it's different to in guys. In guys, just calorie intake seems to regulate these things. But in females, the hypothalamus actually senses glucose availability to the brain. So in times of low glucose, irrespective of calorie intake, that can actually cause menstrual cycle dysfunction. There was one study where they put a bunch of girls on keto, and I think basically all of them either ended up with some dysfunction, like irregular periods, missing periods, or they lost it altogether. Really? And they weren't even on low calories. I believe it was a deficit. It was a weight loss goal of the study. So it was a deficit, but it wasn't crazy low, but there was no glucose. And obviously eventually you end up in ketosis, and that potentially then changes things because you're able to run off those ketones. But in the meantime, that is very, very stressful because you're not adapted to using ketones yet or even producing them. And you don't have what your organs primarily want for now, which obviously is glucose, which then, as you mentioned earlier, then means that the body goes, nope, we're not healthy ourselves, let alone reproducing, and you lose that menstrual cycle. So the macro that people typically, drop is obviously carbs, because they think carbs aren't essential. And it's like, they're technically not, but they actually are. From a menstrual cycle and health standpoint for thyroid production, and of course for training and performance. So now, girls' training often goes like this. And of course, what does training do? It's the stimulus for muscle tissue, and it's a calorie expenditure. So, if you can't train as hard and or you're losing muscle tissue, the amount of calories you're burning per day goes down, which of course makes weight loss harder.
And creates metabolic adaptation.
Yes. And there's a really awesome point on that. Metabolic adaptation in females quickly with muscle tissue. So it works a bit differently. And a lot of girls kind of don't know this. When you finish a diet and you're reverse dieting, or you've just finished a show or a diet and you're just eating everything and getting fat, if you're not actually strategically reverse dieting, but without meaning to, you're reverse dieting, they'll often be like, right, I've gained all the weight back that I've lost, but I'm still, I still have high hunger. I still have a lot of cravings. Like, why is that? And it's because, and I don't think this has been 100% proven, but it's pretty certain that muscle tissue seems to send its own independent signal to the hypothalamus, irrespective of fat tissue, which sends leptin. So it's not until you build back the muscle tissue that you've lost that the things seem to stabilize out, hunger and cravings. And this became really prominent to me when I was chatting to a lot of bikini girls, a lot of them that signed up for my course because they're also coaches, and they're chatting to me about post-show. And then what I'd ask them to figure this out is I would say, did your metabolic rate kind of, coming back to normal in terms of maintaining weight and hunger and cravings coming down, did that line up with your logbook going back to pretty much the best it's ever been, or certainly pre-diet numbers, like your strength, and ability to do more training volume, more sets? And they'd go, yeah. And I go, cool. Well, that's because that's when you built the muscle mass back that you'd lost. Because obviously muscle tissue is a prerequisite for health, right? If you're not healthy, you're not going to build muscle tissue. So the body is kind of going, okay, we haven't built the muscle tissue back that we've lost from this diet, so we're still in a stress state. And it's only when that muscle tissue level comes back to pre-diet levels that the body goes, okay, cool, we now know that we're good now, we're healthy now, we're responsive now.
Because that's now the set point, and your body goes, hey, this is now we're healthy. Yeah. And then when health decreases, it's not until you get back to those levels that your body's like, okay, cool, now we're under stress, but once you get back to those levels, all right, cool, now we're healthy. Yeah, we can stop sending all these signals to
So most people, again, because most coaches are guys and most research is carried out on guys, they think that just happens from body weight, mostly via leptin, right, producing fat tissue. But actually in females, muscle tissue seems to send its own independent kind of signal. And a lot of people are like, you've got to build muscle to increase metabolic rate or try and maintain it. Muscle tissue, like per pound, needs like 8 calories per day or something ridiculous. Like it's not really a meaningful amount, but where it is meaningful is if we lose it, that really tells the body we're in this stress state, slow down metabolism, and it doesn't start coming back up until we build it back. And the kind of the unfortunate irony there is, when are we less likely to train hard, to train consistently and eat enough protein? It's after the diet's finished, right? Because you're bored and fed up. Whether that's training for a fight, whether that's training for a show, whether you're an everyday girl. You've just been training hard. You've just been training when you don't want to train. You've been pushing yourself hard when energy is low. You've just been eating probably a fairly bland, clean diet with lots of protein in it. So now all of a sudden the training frequency comes down, the volume comes down, the intensity potentially comes down, and protein comes down. So we now have this situation where metabolism is slow, we're gaining lots of body fat, but because we're not creating the stimulus or the recovery to get back that muscle tissue, we just keep gaining body fat, even more than what we lost. And people are like, but my weight's the same. Like in theory, this should, because some bikini girls know that, like in theory now this should average out and my weight's back to where it was. Like, why isn't it? You haven't built back the muscle tissue that you lost yet. So making sure that when you finish the diet, you're still getting insufficient training. You're still trying to hit your PBs. Obviously, if you need to take a deload week or whatever, of course do. That's not going to be a problem. Obviously, that's often very necessary. But not throwing training out the window and protein and sleep and stress management out the window because you're fed up with doing all of that stuff once you've finished a diet or training for a fight or whatever it might be is super important, because the quicker you can build back that muscle tissue, the quicker metabolic rate comes up, and the better, for all the reasons we've been chatting about.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to one of the things that I wrote down, which has come up a number of times throughout the conversation. It's like, there's optimal ways to do things, and there's ideal ways to do things suitable to those individual circumstances. Like the optimal way of doing things is like, all right, here's the study, here's the research, here's the scientific evidence. Like, this is what we need to do. This is going to give you best results. But, in reality, it doesn't work like that. We still need to have a look at what people are doing in their lives. We need to, adjust these tools. So, then we're looking at ideal. All right, what's going to be ideal for you right now? What are the ideal protocols that we can start adding in or taking out or whatever it might be? So my question is, when we're looking at, let's say fighters, right? I work at Tiger Muay Thai, I work with professional fighters. When we're looking at females that are competing and they have no input into when they fight, how can we look at giving them we're not going to be able to optimize their hormones, right? Unless we can say, hey, they're going to fight on this date because this is where it falls on their cycle.
Yeah.
How can we give them ideal protocols to be able to kind of manage that fight camp process? Let's say it's an 8-week fight camp. How can we give them protocols that are going to put them in a good position to be able to perform at their best?
Yeah. So there is an answer to this, and I almost don't want to give it because it's not something that I genuinely wouldn't recommend. But the reality is a lot of girls do it. And instead of acting like I don't have an answer for you, I kind of may just as well give it.
I know what your answer is anyway. But
And, you manipulate it with birth control.
Yeah.
A lot of girls do it for stage. Athletes do it because the birth control kind of mimics that first half of the cycle in terms of obviously having, sufficient amounts of estrogen. So a lot of girls will manipulate that with birth control just for short periods of time. Now, there probably isn't really going to be a problem doing that. Anything you do for such short periods of time is probably going to be fine. And
what would you say a short period of time is?
Well, say, the fight is 1 week into the second half of your cycle, you'd probably just need to take the birth control for long enough for it to kick in for you, which is going to depend on if you're having the mini pill or a blend or some stuff which you would just need to decide on what one's best for you. So that's probably only going to be a couple of weeks.
Yep.
You could do it the whole fight camp if you wanted to never have the slight disadvantage of the second half of your cycle. But if you're like, I'm very much prepared to kind of, if the cycle isn't that, doesn't make massive changes for you, and you kind of don't want to do that, it doesn't line up with your values, then, you just do your fight camp and you just change the training stimulus up a little bit. We can chat about how to do that in the second half of the cycle.
Maybe,
and then maybe
go through a little bit of a deload.
Yeah, or you just, well, let's get to that in 1 second. And then you would just kind of like maybe use the birth control for 2 weeks leading up to the fight, so that you're technically in the state of the first half of your cycle when actually you were technically in theory in the second half of your cycle. So using it for a short period of time. I know a lot of girls that do that. And the slight kind of thing to take into account there is is nothing healthy about getting on stage as a bikini girl or getting into a cage and fighting. Yeah. So it's like in the grand scheme of what you're doing to your body, is taking birth control for 2 weeks going to be a problem?
Yeah, this is what I mean, like optimal versus ideal, right? Like we want to be looking at health, but health and performance don't necessarily go hand in hand. Nope. So I'm thinking like, let's look at health all year round, and then, all right, cool. Now we've signed a fight contract. We've got 8 weeks for this fight. All right, now we're training for performance,
there's nothing healthy about that.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
You've laid the foundation and the prerequisites of health to be able to do that.
Exactly.
And that is something the bodybuilding world does so well, and the fight world needs to learn.
Yeah,
most fighters don't reverse diet. They're not tracking any health metrics. They often gain a lot of body fat, and every time they do a fight camp, it becomes harder for them to diet next time because of this metabolic adaptation thing. Whereas bodybuilders get better every show for the most part, because they have a structured off-season or improvement season, as some like to call it. And that's partly due to the reverse dieting, calories up, not gaining body fat, all of that stuff, which is so important. So
I'm building that out at Tiger, bro.
Yeah,
about that.
Yeah, awesome, man. I'm sure you are. So, and that's really valuable. Every time you train for a fight, it should become not easier. Easier isn't the right word, but the weight cut should not get harder, maybe even easier. And you should be better.
You become more refined in the process.
Exactly. Metabolism is in a better place, not a worse place, etc., etc. Again, you look at good men's physique guys or good bikini girls, which, is bodybuilding. Most people, when they think of bodybuilding, think of the bodybuilding category, but men's physique guys and bikini girls are still bodybuilders. They maybe do 1 or 2 shows a year, and every year they're bigger and they're leaner. They're maybe not always healthier if they are running drugs, which is a big if, but they are bigger and leaner. They are better for their sport every year because they have that amazing structure and consistency in the off season, which, as you correctly said, is where you lay the prerequisites and the foundation of health and optimizing things. Because when it is time to drop the hammer, 8-week fight camp or 12-week contest prep, there's nothing healthy about that. So your start point dictates your end point. But yeah, bringing it back to birth control, that is one thing that obviously some females, can consider if they want to. If not, you just kind of have to roll with it, and it is what it is.
Yeah, it's got to weigh everything up and then make the most educated decision that you can.
Exactly. If there's a huge variance for you between your aggression and your coordination and your skill, and you really want to make it as a fighter, I think you'd be silly to take a fight in your second half of your cycle in your luteal phase. So try it. Go on birth control for 2. I don't even want to say try it. Consider trying going on birth control for 2 weeks when in theory you would be in your luteal phase the second half of your cycle, and see if it mimics the first half and see if you feel good. And if it does, don't ever do anything for the first time leading up to a fight. That's never a good idea.
That was exactly my point that I was going to make. Is like do it
trial run.
Yeah.
And if you're like, oh wow, actually, I feel much better on these 2 weeks on birth control than in when I'm normally in my luteal phase, then cool. That's a strategy for you. But again, some girls it really triggers anxiety and mood swings, and it might not. So definitely do a trial run, and know that isn't going to work for everyone, but it is an idea. But again, say you're fighting 5-minute rounds, that's very cardiovascular. Obviously other energy systems are used within that, but 5-minute rounds is a long time to fight. And we have a slightly better, aerobic capacity in that second half of the cycle. So you might be a little bit not as strong, a little bit less aggressive, a little bit less powerful maybe, but your cardio is probably going to actually be a little bit better in the second half of the cycle. So maybe you're someone that is an absolute power puncher, and you're aggressive anyway, and you feel great, but your cardio is a bit of a problem. You might actually be a good thing for you to fight in that second half of the cycle.
It depends on what your game plan is, right?
Exactly.
Like if you want to push the pace, take a little bit of power off, and push the pace and work a little bit more speed. That could work out well for you.
And if it's noticeable for you.
Some
people might do, let's equate just a 25-minute run on a treadmill at 12%, for example. You might do that in your first half of your cycle and your second half and not notice a difference. In which case, then that point, isn't relevant for you. You might notice a big difference. But this is where it comes back to kind of the whole point of this, podcast is, I'm sorry about that, I don't know who that is. The whole point of this podcast is it comes back to, being your own scientist, right? You've got to figure this stuff out for yourself. And then having some sort of benchmark in your training, like knowing your 6-rep max back squat, for example, knowing your 12-minute Cooper time, like knowing a few of these numbers is really, really important, because then you can compare in phase 1 to phase 2, and you can kind of then start to make these obviously educated decisions based on what is best for you.
Awesome, man. Mate, this has been an incredible conversation. I've learned a lot, and hopefully the audience takes a lot on board as well. Is there anything you want to finish up with?
No, mate, I think that's everything, really. There's definitely a few other bits which I think would be valuable if you ever want to do another part. But I think that's great for what we wanted to get through today. So thank you very much for having me on.
Excellent foundational stuff, mate. I really appreciate your time, man.
Super welcome, bro. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you, brother.
And there we have it. Great conversation with Leo Tyson of Tyson Transformations, whose links I'll have in the show notes. This episode was brought to you by B Genki, which is an Australian-made TJ-listed female hormone optimization supplement. It is the sister company of B Spunky, which is a male hormone optimization supplement that I'm affiliated with, that I've been taking for around about a year and a half, and I absolutely love their product. You can go onto their website, begenki.com.au. That is begenki.com.au. This episode was also brought to you by Swiss 8, which is a proactive mental health program designed by veterans to schedule in 8 pillars of health and wellness via an app on your phone. Those 8 pillars of health and wellness are sleep, nutrition, time management, discipline, fitness, personal growth, mindfulness, and minimalism. I know a lot of people going through the lockdown process again, so great way to give yourself some structure and some purpose in your life on a daily basis. That's it for me today, guys. Any 5-star ratings and reviews are much appreciated. Much love. Peace.